Hello, I'm Marvin Kalb, and in just a moment, an hour of live, unedited, unrehearsed conversation with former Governor Bruce Babbitt of Arizona, a Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Stay with us for Candidates 88, coming right up.
This series is made possible by a grant from the New York Stock Exchange Foundation as a public educational service.
From the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Candidates 88 with Marvin Kalb. This week, a conversation with Bruce Babbitt.
Welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. As the caucus and primary season approaches, the politicians are beginning to sound and act more than just a bit edgy, and the political reporters are loving every scrap, every moment of the building tension. As for the American people, well, according to the latest polls, they are finally beginning to pay attention. After all, in a few weeks, they begin to vote, and then the number of political candidates, now numbered at 13, will begin to shrink. With our candidate and guest today, we'll discuss that subject and many others, but first, a little bit about him. Bruce Edward Babbitt is 49 years of age. Occupation, lawyer and presidential candidate. Hometown, Phoenix, Arizona. Family, married, 2 children. Education, a BA in geology from the University of Notre Dame, 1960. As a Marshall Scholar, a Master of Science in Geophysics from the University of Newcastle in England, 1963, and a law degree from the Harvard Law School, 1965. Career, lawyer for the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity, 1965 to 67, Attorney General of Arizona, 1975 to 1978, 2-term Governor of Arizona, 1978 to 1987, now a lawyer with offices in Washington and Phoenix. Let us welcome former Governor Bruce Babbitt. Governor, you believe so strongly in the need to raise taxes in order to lower the budget deficit.
What a way to start an interview, Marvin.
That you literally stood up for the idea during an NBC debate in December. Now, I want to ask you 2 questions in reference to that, one having to do with the taxes, one having to do with why you felt the need to stand up. But on the taxes first. You are proposing a 5% national consumption tax, a kind of value-added tax, as it is referred to in Western Europe, or a national sales tax. And critics have already said that that will place an unfair burden upon the poor. Aside from that point, why do you feel that this kind of tax is the best way of addressing the budget deficit?
Marvin, the important thing is the deficit. We've had a long run in this country of candidates who are ignoring the issue and obviously compromising our economic future. Now, a lot less important than the kind of tax is having the guts to say the word, to say we've got to cut expenditures and raise taxes. Why a consumption tax? It's a tax that is easily administered. It economically makes sense because it dampens down consumption rather than taking income. That's an incentive, I think, to savings and investment. Can you make it progressive? Yes. How do you do that? You can lower the bottom income tax bracket. You can exempt food or medicine. You can mail rebates to those who don't pay income taxes. So I would say it's a progressive consumption tax, that it makes economic sense, and that it's part of the truth-telling that's necessary to address our economic future.
Okay, but is it, in your view, the best way of addressing the budget deficit problem?
Yes, it is. Obviously, there's no silver bullet, but I think candor compels that we admit that the deficit does matter. It's the key to economic growth in the future. And the only way we're going to get at it is to do two things: cut expenditures and raise taxes. I believe the consumption tax is the best form of taxation.
Governor, let me ask you about another major proposal of yours, and that has to do with this means testing. You would like to make certain that all of the money that is earmarked for social programs, in fact, ends up with the poor and not ends up in the middle or upper classes. Two questions. How would you do it in the first place? How would that work? How would it be applied?
Well, Marvin, the concept of needs testing is a way of setting priorities. It's kind of a question. In a sense, it's the opposite of Graham-Rudman, if I can start with Graham-Rudman, which is the philosophy.
You don't approve of it?
No, it's a moral outrage to elect representatives who go to Washington and say, notwithstanding that we're elected to make some choices, we don't have the guts to do it, so we'll cut everything across the board. AIDS research, your student loan, the important things, will all get cut equally with military bands, Star Wars, presidential libraries, that sort of stuff. Now, there's got to be a moral principle behind budget cutting. The needs test asks simply, is that program necessary? And more importantly, is it focused on the basis of need, whether it's mortgage subsidies or entitlements, farm subsidies, whatever it is?
It's all for social spending, though. You're not talking about a needs test for a tank, for example.
Why not?
Well, I'm asking you, is that...
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
sure.
For any kind of government spending.
Sure. A needs test question for the Bradley fighting vehicle or for the MX missile might have prevented them from being built. Imagine
now,
that.
Is this something, Governor, that you feel can be administered by the executive branch of the government?
Oh, absolutely. It's a question that the president must ask and answer. Now, the problem with this political debate is there's a giant wasteland out there. Everybody's saying the deficit's important, but God forbid that any one of them should be caught answering the specific. And the importance of that needs test is I'll tell you how to apply it. I'll tell you how to apply it to your second home down there on the shore. For example, I will say...
Mine?
I can apply to farm subsidies, to home purchases, you name it. The home purchase is a nice example. How many of you have second homes? Well, this is a Harvard audience. I would have expected more, but it's Stu's. But it's a nice example. We subsidize home purchases through the mortgage interest deduction. It's a good idea for first homes. But why do we do it for second homes when there are homeless people that we're not helping at all?
But I mean, how much money are you going to save in terms of taking care of that budget deficit by handling this particular item that you're focusing on?
Okay, you're telling me that's small potatoes.
Well, in effect, yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
So what's the big potatoes that you're talking about?
Okay.
I mean, what's going to cut into the deficit?
Okay, farm subsidies, I think, is a nice one. That's $30 billion. And the problem is that the subsidies are going to the wrong people. They're going to corporations, to agribusinesses. $10 million subsidy checks. That's not why I did. $10 million to one farm in California. Some farm, huh? Some family. Now, obviously, the big fish are the entitlement programs, and I think we need to be honest and admit that.
Social Security.
Sure. And my contention is that what's unreasonable about saying we should subject Social Security benefits to taxation for those who can afford to pay it? I mean, why should the Mellons and the DuPonts have tax-exempt benefits? Does that make sense? Well, that's what a needs test is about. It is a moral criterion, a liberal criterion about how you avoid this mindless kind of cutting and say, in the progressive tradition, we can provide benefits to people that need them, and tanks that work, and defense systems that make sense.
Let's say if you applied this test across the board, as you just indicated, within, say, 2 or 3 years of a Babbitt presidency, where would the budget deficit be by your projections?
Well, my target would be to cut $100 billion out I think that's a nice, manageable target. Now, I gave a speech out in Des Moines about 10 days ago.
In a first term over a 4-year period?
Oh, I'd do that over 2 years.
You feel that you can? I mean, you've run the numbers through the computers and that's the way they come out?
I've run the numbers through a young guy named Bart Gelman, who is my research assistant, and I've put him in a speech. Mm-hmm. And they're actually out there. You can go read them. You know, you can look it up. Mm-hmm. They're there. It's not that hard. Now, the theory, I think, is that you have to do both. You have to have expenditure cuts over the next couple of years of about $40 billion, and then revenue increases of about 50 to 60, which equals 100. Now, the idea roughly is that I think you can sell it by saying, look, our economic future depends on our ability to do it. If we're going to create jobs and end this economy in which the government is using a giant credit card and saying the due bills will be paid by these students in the form of lowered standard of living, a declining economy, loss of leadership. If we're going to do that, we've got to have the guts to step up. I think the way to sell it is to say it will be used for deficit reduction. $1 down, $1 up. We'll cut expenditures and raise revenues. You heard any other candidates say that?
Well, a couple who have come here have offered numbers and have talked in what they took to be specifics.
Oil import. Yeah. Oil import fees.
You have, in fact, stood up for this idea during the NBC debate, and I wanted to...
Be careful, or it'll come again.
I want you to... A number of people, Governor, who find you an extremely attractive and very intelligent candidate are nevertheless disappointed by their inability to explain your feeling that you had to stand up, why you felt the need to go onto a skit at the Saturday Night Live program. In other words, I guess the question is relating to the way in which the political process takes place now.
God, this is great. He's saying Bruce Babbitt is too frivolous. I've heard that for a long time.
No, I'm trying to ask this question. Did you feel yourself at this particular point in the campaign so frustrated by your inability to break out and become one of the acknowledged front runners on the Democratic side that you felt the need to engage in this kind of television gimmickry? Because I think, depending on your answer, that it may say something about the political process, and that's what I'd be interested in finding out your views on.
Sure. I think that during 1987, there's been what I would call a politics of People magazine and National Enquirer. It hasn't exactly been focused on issues. And to some measure, you know, I've kind of been out there in the wilderness making these points, and you're always looking for a way to kind of underline your point of contention. I began in the early debates by asking questions. You remember I asked Governor Dukakis, I'll give you a softball. Give me 2 or 3 domestic cuts. Nothing happened. Mm-hmm. And I did it one-on-one, but what I was looking for was a way I could pose a question to all of them at once. Mm-hmm. And I figured Tom Brokaw is not going to give me a chance to go down that whole list. How do I ask a question and put them all on the spot at once? And that gave rise to the challenging them to stand up.
Is it, in your view, that the political process right now places such a low premium on intelligence? I mean, one of the ironic accusations against Bruce Babbitt is that he's too intellectual. So does that mean that the American people have such a short attention span, even when they're electing their own president, that they can't listen to substance over a period of more than 30 seconds?
Look, Marvin, I honestly don't think that the problem is not the American people. The problem is the leadership across the board in this country. There is what do you do when political candidates won't lead by talking honestly? What do you do when the corporate leaders of this country are saying, we're going to compete and restore a sense of American leadership by impoverishing workers, by cutting wages, by going for a Hong Kong economy instead of really leading and drawing the productivity out of people? What do you say about a White House in which Mike Deaver, you know, is selling access to the Oval Office for $150,000 a minute when the Attorney General is, you know, on the wrong side of the grand jury? Now, I think that that's just a way of answering your question by saying that it's hard to blame the American people. The problem is a failure of leadership.
Is it part of the process that we all see you go through? I mean, not just you personally, but all of the presidential candidates. Another candidate had Uncle Sam on stilts walk into a room preceding him in order to get somebody's attention.
God, I never thought of that.
Yeah. Let's deal with a few more of the specific ideas that you may have for governing this country, Governor. You've talked in the past about a workplace democracy, a way of getting workers actually involved in the ownership of the plant in which they work. I assume that being a way of increasing the competitiveness of the American workplace. You have said that by 1996 you'd like to have 2/3 of the American workers participating to some degree anyway in the ownership of their plant. Two questions. As President, how would you make that happen? How would it work?
Well, I think it's an important concept, a big one. Rather than cutting wages and telling people you got to work longer and earn less to compete, a sort of Hong Kong model, I think what we do is try to bring out the best, the initiative in workers by listening to them, by asking for their cooperation, and by sharing the profits. Now, your question is, how am I going to do that? Obviously, much as I'd like to, as President of the United States, I'm not going to walk into the boardroom of General Motors and start handing out their stock to their employees. That's not my function. You can use the bully pulpit. Instead of busting the air controllers union, sending a message that we ought to, raise and exacerbate the tensions in the workplace, we start talking about these concepts. There are some economists, I must concede, at a neighboring university down the Charles River here, Martin Weitzman and some of these guys, who talk very compellingly about how it is you would set up incentives in the tax code to give special preference to profit sharing, to those kinds of concepts, to employee stock ownership. The concept of sharing, of motivating people by saying you got a stake in the result.
Now, I've seen a lot of this happen myself in Western Europe to some good effect. And I'm wondering, are you using that as a model for your own proposal?
Sure. Those are models, but I'll tell you there are better ones right here in the American economy. There are really some striking examples. There's a company called Lincoln Electric in Cleveland, Ohio, which has been at it for 50 years. Procter & Gamble has had plans like this. Ford Motor Company is moving in this direction. America is a huge, diverse laboratory full of really interesting examples. And it seems to me what the president does is, from the bridge of the ship, looking at where we're going in the world, and holds up the good examples and tries to put the moral authority of the office behind them. At the same time that you point out the abuse. I was in Iowa last week saying that IBP is a corporate outlaw. People say, that's pretty strong stuff. And I said, well, I'm running for president. And I think that what they're doing is an outrage. And I think that's what campaigns are about, is having the courage to say it.
You think as president, if you were elected, to be able to stand up before an international audience and just pick on a company and say that's a bad guy and that's a good one?
Well, if they're really worthy, if they're bad enough to be worthy of that kind of attention, sure. That's what leadership is about, is moral values. And that's lacking in Washington now. That's why we have all these speculators running wild on Wall Street. That's Boesky and Deaver have kind of become symbols of the last 7 or 8 years. A quick killing, a speculative casino is what it's all about. Why don't we start honoring work and talking about the people who make things and produce things?
Governor, I'd like to move on to the time that you were governor in the state of Arizona. You had to deal, obviously, with the problems of illegal immigration, and you had to deal with a constituency, a significant part of which is Hispanic. Now, you speak Spanish. As president, how would you deal more effectively with the problems of illegal immigration?
Marvin, I'd start by trying to get at the root causes. Suppose you were 20 years old, living in the mountains somewhere in Mexico or Central America, trying to raise a family and an economy in which The standard of living has dropped 50% in the last 5 years. What would you do? I know what I'd do. Head for the border, real fast. I met a kid in El Salvador at one of these return centers that the Immigration Service sets up, who told me he had been deported from the United States 17 times. And I said, that's a lot. And he said, you'll never keep me out. You'll never keep me out because I don't have a chance here in my country. Now, what that talks about, it seems to me, is dealing thoughtfully and decisively with the debt issues that are destroying those economies, redrawing the trading agreements to give them stronger access to American markets, working strongly on the economic issues. Now, obviously, you have to police the border. You have to do the best you can, but it's always a matter of a finger in the dike until we change the root conditions that are causing so much trouble in Central America and particularly in Mexico. Mexico's a tremendous problem. The president is obsessed with Nicaragua. I think he wakes up in the night, you know, with the ghosts of Nicaragua parading across the stage. With, you know, this, they're reading Marxist books down there, you know. And that country has 2 million people. Mexico has 82 million people. You ever hear him say anything about that? That's both, I think, the problem and the opportunity.
Well, in fairness to the president, I believe one of the first foreign leaders he met was the president of Mexico.
I remember that. They met and the president gave him a rifle as a present.
Governor, as far as the issue of the Spanish language, do you feel that, given the number of Hispanics in the United States now, that Spanish should become, in effect, sort of de facto, I suppose, the second official language of this country?
Marvin, the word official is kind of a pejorative term. You know, that's what the kind of... That's
why I tried to soften it, de facto. I mean, you are...
Look, well, we should be a country of many languages. We must, as we now move into this kind of unitary international world, it seems to me, stress the learning of languages.
No, but you know what I'm talking about. We're talking here about whether you would actually use Spanish along with English in many, many states in the Sun Belt to teach about American history and everything else, biology. How would you...
English should be the language of instruction in commerce and daily intercourse in the United States. We should encourage the teaching of other languages, and we should be aggressive about bilingual education.
Okay.
But no, do we want to be Quebec? No, definitely not.
Okay.
Pero estoy de acuerdo con el concepto que la lengua española tiene una fuerza importante en esta vida. But no.
We're going to have to roll some slides. Governor, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your Catholicism, not as a personal matter, but how your religion might affect the way in which you would govern. And you've described yourself as a rigorous Catholic. On the issue of abortion, do you see abortion as the killing of human life?
As a Catholic, yes. As a governor, I understand that there are many religious and ethical groups who come to a different conclusion, and that it is an ethical issue on which the very existence of so much diversity sends a message to public officials that it should be left outside the area of legislation to the ethical conscience of individuals.
So that, to be consistent from the Catholic point of view, you would favor a constitutional ban against abortion, but as a legislator or an executive would be against
absolutely
it?
Not. I am pro-choice. It is an ethical issue that should remain outside legislation, outside constitutional dictates.
Okay.
Because
on an issue such as revolutionary theology, which is widespread in Latin America, the Pope has taken a very strong position. He even chastised a number of the priests who were part of the social upheaval working out of the church in order to advance social needs as they see it. The church says, Catholic Church says no officially. Do you support or oppose the Pope's position on this?
Well, look, if you become a priest or a bishop, I suppose, you acknowledge that the Pope tells you what to do. Now, I happen to think the Catholic Church has been a tremendously progressive force in Latin America. It didn't used to be the case. They used to automatically, be palling around with all those guys wearing gold uniforms, standing on balconies, resisting change. The wonderful story of Latin America is that more often than not, the Catholic Church is now on the side of the people, and revolutionary theology is just liberation theology. It's just one manifestation of that. I think it's a tremendous change. And I think
a change for the good.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Governor, a little bit more than on foreign policy. You have said on the issue of America's nuclear deterrent, I quote, "We will never be the first to use nuclear weapons in any conflict," unquote. Now, that sounds to me very much like the Soviet pledge of no first strike. It also seems to be a very radical change in the American nuclear deterrent position over the last 25 years, led by both Republicans and Democrats in the White House. Am I correct on both counts?
Marvin, no, that's not a complete sentence, that first quote.
Okay, give me what your feeling is, please.
This. We ought to move as far as we can toward a posture of no first use. Because, you see...
That has not been a pledge of no first use.
No, because we simply aren't in a position to do that, particularly in Europe. And in a sense, an absolute pledge compromises deterrence. The problem is that we've gone in the opposite direction in Europe. General Galvin over there says, in the first week of a conventional war, I will be driven to the use of nuclear weapons. Now, my point, and it's one that somehow isn't being debated, is how can the United States of America put itself in the position of a NATO strategy which says that in the event, unlikely though it may be, of an outbreak of hostilities, we'll be firing nuclear weapons and escalating to Armageddon in the first week of a conventional war.
But Governor, you know why that is the case.
I know why. The reason it's the case is because we become over-reliant on cheap nuclear weapons, and we've abandoned our responsibility to think carefully about the conventional defense of Europe, how it is we, for example, integrate the French back into NATO, how it is we have some modest increases in defense spending, build up the reserves, reconfigure the American support. We've gotten lazy. We've gotten lazy by relying on nuclear weapons, and I'm saying we ought to try to reverse that as much as we can by strengthening our conventional defenses.
Let us shift to the Middle East for a moment. There have been in recent weeks Palestinian riots and demonstrations in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In recent weeks as well, the Reagan administration has chosen to abstain rather than to veto a UN condemnation of Israel for the deportation of a number of the Palestinians. As president, would you have vetoed or, like the Reagan administration, abstained on that issue?
Well, unaccustomed as I am to supporting the Reagan administration, I believe that their position on those two issues in the United Nations was correct. That's really not the issue. The issue is, what are we going to do about a situation which has become gridlocked? I think we're headed toward a tragedy in the Middle East. If America continues to acquiesce in a psychology which says the problem is insoluble, and therefore we'll quit trying. In Jerusalem, there's gridlock. The Israelis seem to have, their process is beginning to look like American politics. There's no consensus for anything, and there's drift. And we all know that that's ultimately going to threaten Israel, it's going to threaten our interests, and that it's up to the United States to have some active diplomacy in the Middle East. I mean, after all, a guy named Jimmy Carter pulled off an extraordinary success.
Well, that's fair enough. But
we've gone to sleep. What do we do?
What you specifically, you're president and you address that problem, what specifically would you do?
Well, I would go to the Israelis and remind them that America is now supporting their economy and their military force at unprecedented levels, that our commitment to Israel is correct, properly placed, and I reaffirm it. But I would say the best thing a friend can do for another friend is to speak the truth. And the truth is you must take stronger initiatives and be more creative about how it is you move toward forms of autonomy for the residents of Gaza and the West Bank. I would then go to the Arabs and say, you guys better wake up. I've got the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf defending all of you, and I'd like something in return, and it consists of a little more creativity and a little more motion. I'd go to the Egyptians and say, you were pioneers. We can bring you back into the process. I'd try to stiffen King Hussein's spine a little bit. I'd try to isolate Assad. I think Assad is, that the events in the Arab world are now beginning to move him off to the periphery. Have you heard him saying anything in Washington? That's the problem. We've checked out of the process. I don't know what the ultimate result is. I know what the principles are. We must move toward. The principles are written in the Camp David Accord. Motion toward autonomy for the Arabs, security for Israel, and we've got to start searching for it.
Governor, would you, so that I am at least clear on what you've just said, you would, as far as the Israelis are concerned, go there with a threat of a cutback in U.S. economic and military support unless they did something?
Well, look, you don't threaten your friends. You just remind them of the facts.
And assume that they would pursue it.
Sure. The Israelis are on dead center because of some very complex problems in their own society, but also because they're not feeling any pressure from us.
And the leverage, the pressure that you would apply, for example, on the Egyptians, who also receive a significant amount of American money, is the same?
Well, yeah.
A threat of a cutback in order to...
I'd remind them of the friendship and the value of the aid. And suggest that they could begin reciprocating by getting back into the game.
And would you also feel that you would actually cut back on both sides if they didn't come through?
See, that's the question that you don't answer in advance among friends.
Let me just ask you a few more questions about politics, and then we'll go to the audience. When Gary Hart re-entered the race, you said that we'd know in a few days whether he'd be the front runner again or whether he'd be a ghost of Christmas past. Now, Christmas has come and gone.
And my crystal ball has been shattered to bits.
Okay. The specific question is, has Hart's reemergence helped or hurt Bruce Babbitt in Iowa?
Well, Senator Hart entered the race saying, these other guys have nothing to say. I have a universe of big, bold, new ideas. And we ought to hold him to that test. Now, the first debate of 1988 is tomorrow night in Sioux City, Iowa. Senator Hart's not going to be there. I mean, what kind of campaign is that? If he has all these great ideas, I think he ought to show up and start talking about it. And, I thought of something. Maybe he doesn't have the price of a plane ticket. That's a problem in this campaign, too. And I'd be happy to buy him a ticket if he needs it.
But does it help or hurt Bruce Babbitt in Iowa? You've looked at the numbers.
Yeah.
What does it say to you?
I think it's potentially an opportunity because he comes in claiming to be the harbinger, if not, the anointed agent of new ideas. And that's a turf that I have some interest in.
Right.
And therefore, I think potentially it's a big help because if I can kind of flush him in out of the woods and actually get him into one of these debates and say, okay, let's, you say they're new ideas, but most of them are old and a lot of them aren't very good. And let's see if we can join the discussion and get it going. That's the opportunity. Now, obviously, in the short run, he's hurt all of us in the Iowa polls. Cut Senator Simon's support in one of those one of the polls in half, mine in more than half, but in the long run, an opportunity.
Okay, Governor, I want to thank you, and we're at that point now in the program where I stop asking the questions. We go out to the audience. I know 3 people in the audience who are going to ask questions, though I don't know what they are going to ask, and I don't know what anyone else is going to ask, too. There are microphones conveniently set up. If you want to ask a question, ask the question. Don't make a speech. And, Governor, the briefer your responses, the more questions we'll get. That's obvious.
I don't get to make speeches either.
No.
Okay.
Our first questioner is Dean Patricia Graham, who knows a good deal about education here at Harvard University.
Governor Babbitt, I'd like to ask you a question about how you would see your role differently as President of the United States than as Governor in the field of education, particularly about the federal government's role in education and what your priorities would be to meet what I believe you call the needs test for federal expenditures, the moral criteria to be used. The current administration has escalated the rhetoric about education to considerable effect. I wonder what you would do about programs for children of low-income families in the schools, for preschool programs, and for educational research.
Tina, I think you covered in the last sentence the real priorities. Early childhood is the source of the greatest opportunity in American education. I'll tell you, I learned one thing as a parent and as an educational reformer in Arizona. After seeing all the delinquency, the dropouts, the drug abuse, I rediscovered something as a parent that we all know, and that is that the dropouts you can spot in the first and second grade because our failures are coming in early childhood. First grade is too late in a changing society that we all understand the implications of. I think the absolute first priority is universal Head Start for 4-year-olds and a strong, strong program of subsidized daycare in voucher form for working parents. So we've got to get these kids started earlier. Now, the other important education issue is at the university level, and it comes in two forms. One is student aid. I don't think it's realistic to say, and I don't think we should say to students, you're entitled to a free grant. We should say to every student, you're entitled to low-interest loans if you want to pursue education. We can forgive them on the back end for public service, for teaching, for that kind of thing. We must step up dramatically our aid for research, particularly laboratories and instrumentation.
Next question in the balcony, please.
Sir, there's a growing concern about, I'll give that to you again. There's a growing concern from parents and teachers about the increasing use of the abusive drug Ritalin in our school systems, which is considered the most destructive element to the quality of our failing school systems. What would you do about this as president?
There's no silver bullet on drugs. Obviously, eradication at source, coordination of prosecution efforts. Got to tell you, we're never going to solve the drug problem until we deal with the demand side, until we change the culture of demand for drugs.
I want to clarify this, sir. This is actually a psychiatric drug that's used abusively on children for curing a fictitious hyperactivity.
I'm sorry, I'll have to learn a little more about it. I don't know the answer. I don't know the drug, and I don't know the problem. Invite me back.
Many of us will have to do that. Next question right here, please.
Governor Babbitt, the New Republic named you as a very effective governor of Arizona, dealing with a Republican legislator in a very conservative state. I'd be interested to know how you accomplished pushing through progressive legislation in a conservative state, and as president, how you would deal with the legislature, whether you think it's comparable to the federal legislature, how you deal with Senators Dole and Simon as president. Thank you.
Senators Dole and Simon. Well, Dole will still be a senator, and so will Simon. Now, let me see if I can retranslate that question. I think what you're really saying is can a governor really deal with the United States Congress? I'll tell you, after 9 years of dealing with a wall-to-wall Republican legislature, the United States Congress isn't going to be that difficult. How do you deal with them? You use the veto power. You use the bully pulpit to lay out an agenda. And you use carrots and sticks. You remember that everybody in Congress needs recognition. Half of them want a new traffic signal in some district or a new school grant program. And you keep a little book. You reward your friends. People who don't cooperate never get the traffic light or the school district. But most of all, you appeal to a sense of common decency and expectations and deal with them as people and recognize them and work with them. It's been done in the past, and it's not that complicated. You've got to have some human juice in it, of course.
Next question right here, please.
Mr. Babbitt, in 2 different newspaper articles, you were described as one who is a master of the art of the possible in politics, and another one described you as a Catholic who believes in miracles. And I wanted to know which of those things holds true as far as your chances are concerned to wind up at the other side of the Democratic pack, as you're obviously now.
Wow. Anybody else got a question? Look, I'm a practitioner of the possible. I believe in both. Well, I believe in miracles in this world. Now, how am I going to win in Iowa? Is that what you're really asking? Look, I believe that people out there are sick and tired of candidates who reflect this moral deficit that I talked about, who believe that America really has a future, who understand intuitively that America's winning all over this world, that our ideals are in the ascendancy, that we've created a new world economy, that Marxism is, it's dead meat. And what we need here is leaders at home who will explain to us candidly how we make a few changes to reach that new world, who will have the guts to say, there's a ticket to that destination and that voyage, and it's not free. We need to deal with that deficit. We need to make these changes in the American workplace. My wager is real simple, that in the Iowa caucuses on February 8th, there's going to be a surprising number of people who will say, yeah, that's right. That's what America's about. This guy doesn't have the most money, not the best known, but he's saying something. And he ought to be president. The pollsters are saying who will be president. I think they're going to ask who ought to be president.
I'd like now to call on Mike Lapson, a member of the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics.
Governor, my question is about Central America. I've read that you would not send aid to the Contras and that you do support the Arias peace plan. Do you think that plan has produced any progress towards peace in Central America? And what do you think the United States' role should be in the region?
Look, I think we all understand that the Arias peace plan is having tough sledding. One reason it's been so slow is because the Reagan administration, by its rhetoric and by its deeds, and in the person of Elliott Abrams, is trying to sabotage the Arias peace plan. They're doing everything they can to fulfill their prophecy that it will not work. What should we do? Terminate Contra aid? We should listen to our friends in those countries, back up that peace plan, and try to take a broader view to understand that it's the other 97% of Central America that's at risk and at issue, and that is the opportunity, all the way from Mexico to Panama. The meeting in Guatemala City, I think, began to illustrate the power that those presidents have when they come together. And we ought to try to raise the ante economically with trade, with movement back toward a Central American common market, with a systematic plan for debt reduction. Try to get a wave going in the opposite direction.
Our next question in the balcony, please.
Governor, in the hearing of Iran Gate, Ellie North revealed that there is a plan under which, in an emergency situation, all our constitutional liberties can be suspended. Neither the press, newspapers, television, nor the Congress chose to discuss it. Do you know about this plan? Can you tell us how do you explain that neither the press nor the Congress discuss it? There is a very dangerous precedent, 33, enabling plan in Germany, 1933. What do you know about it? What can you tell us?
I don't know anything about the plan. If you elect me president, and if I discover it, I will apply a match to it immediately.
Right here, next question, please.
Governor, when working class Americans, particularly those who belong to unions, hear the name Bruce Babbitt, many think immediately of your role as the governor of the state of Arizona in a very bitter strike by copper miners against the Phillips Dodge Company. There you mobilized the resources of the state, including the National Guard, to intervene on behalf of the company, escorting strike breakers across the picket line. As a result, the strike was broken, the union was broken, and thousands of copper miners permanently lost their jobs. My question is, do you still feel that you did the right thing? And can working Americans expect the same treatment at the hands of President Babbitt as the copper miners received under the hands of Governor Babbitt? Thank you.
That guy's not a Babbitt supporter, I suspect. There were actually two copper strikes, one in 1983. It got bitter, the violence began to escalate, and one night in a small town named Ajo, Arizona, There's a lot of random gunfire in the street. And a 3-year-old girl named Chandra Taland woke up in her bed in the middle of the night screaming with blood gushing out of her head. A .22 bullet had gone right through her forehead, just off the street, through the head of this child. We air-evac'd her out to Phoenix. She had some emergency surgery, and miraculously she recovered. I went up a couple days later to visit this child, and I walked into a room, and here's this kid sitting in a bed, recovered, playing with a teddy bear. The mother picks the kid up, we're all kind of yucking it up, and puts that child in my arms, and then looks at me, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, "Governor, what are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else's 3-year-old kid?" About a month later, the violence broke out again in another town called Morenci. The rocking, the arson, the gunfire. And I did what I had to do as governor, and I simply said there isn't going to be any more violence. I'm going to protect everybody, strikers, scabs, but most of all innocent people. And there was no more violence, and no one was killed. Now, the union was decertified, and obviously there wasn't a lot of celebrating about what I had to do as governor. But let me tell you something. 3 years later, there was another copper strike. Do you know about that one? Do you know how that one ended up? The 1986 copper strike, do you know about that one? What happened? It was settled. They won a contract, right. Went up to a strike deadline, didn't it? There was a long, intense mediation. You know who was called in as the mediator in that copper strike? The governor of Arizona, Bruce Babbitt. Because the unions understand that I've supported their efforts across the years. And when they came up to the edge the second time around, I got a call from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from the United Steelworkers saying, "We can't find an appropriate mediator. Will you do it?" And I did it. And I took him behind closed doors, and I won a settlement. What does that add up to? Bruce Babbitt's a friend of labor. We've had our differences, but I'm a friend of labor.
In the balcony, please, the next question.
Governor Babbitt, in recent weeks, national attention has been focused on the racially motivated murders in Howard Beach, New York. Furthermore, in your own home state, Governor Meekum has a shaky history relative to racial relations, and has even abolished the Martin Luther King birthday, among other...
Established by whom?
Yourself, sir.
Good. Ask the question, please.
In the light of upcoming Dr. King's birthday, to what extent do you see racism as a problem in modern America? And as president, what steps would you take to alleviate such problems?
Look, it's a real problem. It kind of reminds me of climbing a mountain. In the last 30 years in this country, we've come an extraordinary way. Made a lot of progress. I was in the streets of Selma, Alabama in 1965. I spent 2 years in the civil rights movement, and I watched with my own eyes as we made enormous progress in eliminating the legal barriers. But we've only gone halfway because the economic barriers are still there. And the reason the tensions are rising is because there's no perception of progress. What would I do as president? First of all, I'd do an extraordinary thing. I'd hire an attorney general who believed in law enforcement. I would then try to deal honestly with the economic issues. Kids with no jobs roaming the streets of cities because there aren't any jobs. High school dropouts. Continuing discrimination in the workplace. I'd say, come on, we can do a better job. We can find the resources to keep those kids in school, to provide public work to help them make the transition, and then to get the economy going and make certain that there are jobs for everyone who needs them.
Next question right here, please.
Mr. Governor, Bhopal, India has witnessed the chemical holocaust. What programs do you have to prevent our multinational corporation to use third world countries as a dumping ground of solid and hazardous waste? And in case of nuclear and chemical emergency here in America, what programs do you have to protect our life?
Look, we haven't had any environmental enforcement in this country. We need to deal with the toxic problem by eliminating the use of toxics, by setting higher toxic standards, by having a national groundwater law, by having an acid rain law. And by recognizing that we live in a global commons, and what we prohibit at home, we cannot tolerate it abroad. We simply have to say, we're not only going to provide an example here at home, but we will adopt the same standards abroad, and even go to summit meetings and say the environmental issues ought to be dealt with in the context of international treaty making.
Thank you.
Next question right here, please.
Governor Babbitt, as an Arizonan, welcome. Step forward. Governor, we are besieged in Arizona with the contamination of the groundwater. Here with the shores of the sea and other types of contaminants, as the including air, of course, also. As President of the United States, what programs or policies do you have to clean up our environment?
I think the priorities are water, because obviously it's not just an environmental problem, it's a health problem. Too much lead in water is mentally retarded infants, too many nitrates, blue baby syndrome. We need a law enforcement officer at EPA. We do need a national groundwater law. We need to start setting standards for toxics, and they're not doing it. We need to get on. They've identified, 20,000 hazardous waste dumps. They've cleaned up 13. At that rate, they'll have the job done, I don't know, I've calculated, in the year 3,000. We need to just understand that it's a priority. It must be done.
In the balcony, please.
Governor Babbitt, you've spoken to us about your views on increased worker participation and control in American businesses. My question is a bit more general. What do you perceive as the ideal relationship between American government and private business in this country? And to the extent that your view differs from the relationship as it exists now, what would you as president in 1988 begin to do to change that relationship?
Well, I've talked already about the need for government to set an example, to use the tax system, the regulatory system, the Securities and Exchange Commission, all of those tools to make a statement, to say that we're headed the wrong way when we try to compete by saying to businesses, you can cut wages, you can exploit workers, we'll compete by impoverishing workers on the Hong Kong model. It's the wrong way to go. And to turn back instead and say we must encourage participation, equity. Speak out about the abuses of golden parachutes and outrageous employee bonuses, the General Motors model. You cut workers' wages and then give the managers $170 million in bonuses. But above all, we must deal honestly with this issue of the deficit, because there won't be any jobs, there won't be futures, there won't be money for higher education, for health care for our parents, for education. And, Marvin, I told you I was going to come to it. This issue of the deficit, people aren't being honest about it. Now, what I did in that debate back in December was say to the other candidates, let's get honest. Won't you, by standing up, agree with one simple proposition, that in order to assure our future, we will all acknowledge that we've got to tell the truth. That we must deal with that deficit. We must cut expenditures and raise taxes. Now, let me ask you, are you willing to stand up and acknowledge that that's the beginning of truth in the political process? Are you willing? Are you willing to stand up? Okay.
Governor, we've got to end the program. Sit down. We have one more questioner, and that is Kurt Campbell, a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School of Government.
Well, I have to stand to ask my question. I'd like to draw you out a little bit on U.S.-Soviet relations. In the wake of the recent so-called Gorbomania, which has swept the United States, some have suggested that, in fact, we've perhaps concentrated too narrowly on his style rather than his substance. Now, in the realm of foreign policy, Gorbachev has surrounded himself with a coterie of shrewd and sophisticated foreign policy associates, some with decades of experience. Now, our own administration has depended on perhaps a less experienced group of advisors. Now, my question to you, Governor, is this. As president, where will you look? In commerce, in business, in academia, at our own foreign service, and what kind of individuals will you look to help shape American foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis the Soviet Union?
Well, of course, I'd start at the Kennedy School of Government. But let me just take that question quickly in two different directions. We've demoralized the foreign service in this country by bringing in amateurs and ideologues rather than relying on talent. There are people right here, Graham Allison, Al Carnesale, Joe Nye. They're all over the United States waiting to be called into service. Now, the fundamental fact of our relationship with the Soviet Union is that it's undergoing a dramatic change. It's a change that's being driven by the fact that American economic ideals are taking root all over this world. The Cold War is over. We've won. Marxism is dead. Gorbachev knows that. I don't know whether he's reading my memos or listening to my speeches, but he's ready to sign the death warrant for Marxism. That's the explanation of why it is he's now out seeking accommodation and change. And above all, America must respond. We're not. We're remaining silent as if we're on the defensive. It's time to recognize the Cold War is over, that we're winning, and that together we can remake the world.
Governor, finally in about 15 seconds, what would be the one question you would like to ask Gorbachev if you sat down with him?
Whether or not Raisa is really running the show.
You think she is?
She's an impressive woman, and so's my wife. And
Governor, thanks very much for being our guest today. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks to you all for being here. Next week, the last interview in our series with Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, the Republican candidate for President of the United States. Now, on behalf of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, I'm Marvin Kalb, and we'll see you next week on Candidates 88.